Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Gonzalo Saiz, research analyst for the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RIS Europe, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar discussion. The topic, as you all know, is sanctions and illicit finance in Taliban Afghanistan, and I have the pleasure to be accompanied by an excellent panel of speakers who are experts in this topic and will help us unveil this complex context and bring some clarity to the discussion. I'm very happy to introduce, first off, Jessica Davis. Jessica is the president of Inside Threat Intelligence and our very own CSCS Associate Fellow. Hi, Jessica. Welcome. We're also joined by Alex Sturden. Alex is the founder and principal of Capital Peak Strategies and adjunct senior fellow at the Center for Neo-American Security. Hello, Alex. Welcome. And last but certainly not least, we're joined by Aryan Sharifi. Aryan is a lecturer at the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. Hello, Aryan. Thank you for joining us. Well, we have a bit under an hour to unpack certainly a very complicated topic. So let's get right on to it. I'll just briefly say as house rules that we have a Q&A function that we welcome everyone to use, and we will leave 15 minutes at the end to address any questions that will be on the record. So maybe, Aaron, let me start off things with you. I think in order to understand the current state of affairs in Afghanistan, I think it's necessary to take a few steps back and see how things have developed. Can you paint us a picture of what the illicit financial landscape in the country looked like before the Taliban take over in August 2021?
Hello, Gonzalo, and hello and good day to everyone that is listening to this webinar. I think the main thing to note pre-Taliban takeover was that there was a symbiotic relationship between illicit economic activity and terrorism and violent extremism, a type of relationship in which terrorist organizations would create ungoverned and undergoverned territories and challenged the state's law enforcement capabilities, thereby facilitating the situation in which illicit economic actors could engage in activities. And then in return, these illicit economic activities would fund the existence and the operations of terrorist organizations and violent extremist groups. So this tight, symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationship existed for years prior to the Taliban takeover. Now, illicit economic activities in this tight symbiotic relationship took place at least in 5 sectors that we in the former Afghan government could pinpoint. The first sector, obviously, was the drug industry, and which created hundreds of millions of dollars per year for the Taliban and other terrorist organizations. 3 main types of drugs were at the time produced and smuggled. The top of the list, obviously, was opium and its refined and processed version, heroin. Our estimates in the former Afghan government at the time was that the Taliban and related terrorist organizations would get at least $500 million a year from the opium industry. The second drug was methamphetamine, which is new to Afghanistan, relatively new to Afghanistan. And the main ingredient for the production of methamphetamine, the ephedra plant, apparently is in abundance and naturally in Afghanistan. And the rest of the chemical precursors that are used to produce this drug were easy to procure given the lax law enforcement mechanism at the time. But our intelligence reports suggested at the time that the technical know-how for the production of this drug mainly came through illicit actors from Iran and potentially even from Pakistan and China at the time to produce this meth. How much overall the value of this was difficult to pinpoint, but our estimates was in the several $100 million per year. And then finally, the third drug was hashish, or cannabis, which were mainly used inside Afghanistan, but also some were exported abroad that generated some funds to the Taliban and other organizations. The second sector in which illicit economic activities took place in this symbiotic relationship was illicit mining which of course took place across the country. And the Taliban and other terrorist organizations took advantage of this in at least two ways. The first way was directly exploiting mineral resources in areas that were under their control. And then the second way that they took advantage of this was taxing other illicit actors, mainly warlords and local strongmen who exploited illegally these mineral resources. And so the Taliban and other groups taxed that, which also amounted to several hundred millions of dollars per year to these groups. The third sector in which illicit economic activities took place and benefited terrorism at the time was extortion. Now, extortion also took place mainly in two ways. One was directly charging protection money. The Taliban and other organizations charged protection money directly to individuals, to business people, to NGOs, to international organizations, even to military convoys at the time to pass. And then the second way they took advantage of this illicit economic activity was kidnapping for ransom, which mainly took place on Afghan citizens, but also to foreign and Western citizens, as we all know. Fourth was illicit logging, or what they call flora crimes, which mainly took place in eastern Afghanistan. The Taliban's Haqqani network was heavily involved in this, but also the TTP, the Pakistani terrorist group, as well as ISIS-K was heavily involved in this activity and generating a lot of funds for that. And finally, the fifth industry, which we could pinpoint that benefited terrorism at the time, was illegal human transportation, which took place both in terms of human trafficking and human smuggling, bringing in funds to the Taliban. Overall, these five sectors were in operation for years, and through this tight, symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationship, provided a lot of funds for the functioning and existence of terrorist groups in Afghanistan.
That's fascinating. Thanks, Aaron. The thing is, no easy task to summarize such an intricate scene. So, as we know, the Taliban took over successfully Afghanistan in August 2021. So maybe we can turn to Jessica and get some thoughts on how the access to power by the Taliban has impacted this landscape that Aaron is describing for us.
Thanks, Gonzalo. Absolutely. So the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan essentially gave the Taliban control of the Afghan economy and gained access to all of its resources, both licit and illicit. So all of the things that Arian was talking about continue to be sources of income for the Taliban and other terrorist groups in Afghanistan. But now the Taliban has access to other resources, including things like the taxation base. So now it's really in a position of a great deal more control and influence over the Afghan economy, such that it is. The Taliban takeover has also complicated financial relationships in the region and beyond. While international banking connections were fairly common under pre-Taliban conditions, once the Taliban took over, those banking connections were reduced, with the exception particularly of regional actors and a few key international players who continue to do business with the Taliban. And the Taliban, of course, has a bit of a complicated relationship with the drugs trade, one of the main sources of revenue for Afghanistan. They alternatively ban it, but also profit from it. And the full extent of that ban and how it's enforced varies by location and by shifting political will as economic and social conditions dictate. So that continues to be an evolving area of revenue for the Taliban. And the illicit financial landscape is also dotted with other non-state actors like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State affiliate in Afghanistan, ISIL Khorasan province, and a number of other groups. These actors take advantage of many of the same sources of funds as the Taliban did prior to becoming, once again, the government of Afghanistan. Arian gave us a great overview of exactly how that works. Things like drug cultivation or taxation, those taxation and extortion rackets, things like border taxes as well. In the case of ISIL-KP, the group has also received external support from ISIL Central, although I will add here that the Islamic State generally encourages its various provinces to achieve financial independence as quickly as possible, deploying external advisors to facilitate that process. So those transfers of funds are not always ongoing, more of on an as-needed basis. with the intention of having the provinces, including ISIL-KP, become financially independent. So that's a general overview of how the landscape has shifted since the Taliban took over.
Excellent. Thanks, Jessica. Well, I'm curious with all this alternate source of wealth, that both licit and illicit, how they're getting the capabilities regarding financial movements. I welcome Alex. I think you can add a bit to what Jessica was saying, but also give us some insights into how they're moving their funds and so on.
Yeah, Gonzalo, thank you so much. And thank you to Rusi and everyone joining today. So I think I just want to provide a little bit of texture and some further details on what Ariane and Jessica have laid out, because it was critically important. The Taliban has improved its ability to raise and then subsequently move revenue. We saw before the takeover, just to give some numbers, according to the UN, that as of June 2021, the Taliban raised somewhere between 300 million to 1.6 billion annually. And in addition to the sources that Ariane and Jessica identified, I just wanted to also highlight wealthy individual donors and charitable donations and foreign funding as a bucket and a source, because I think that matters as we look moving forward. Now, as Jessica mentioned, they control the entire customs and tax revenue system. And there was recent data reported out that just between March and December 2022, so a 9-month period, the Taliban collected over 1.54 billion in tax revenue. So that's a substantial increase. If they were looking at a top line of 1.6 annually, they have 1.54 just in a 9-month period, according to economic data. But we have very limited visibility into the movement of funds within Afghanistan. I think that is a constraint and a challenge affecting analysts and policymakers around the world. The banking sector, as Jessica mentioned, is highly distressed, and much of the economic activity occurs through the Hawala system, which is lightly, more charitably, and likely unregulated in Afghanistan at this point. But there are strong financial links to places like regional financial hubs in Pakistan, Doha, Dubai, as well as Turkey. And so those are avenues for the Taliban to move funds. And then the Taliban has also expanded their trade and formal overt economic cooperation with actors like Russia and China, which is a source of revenue for Afghanistan and a source of barter and other benefits. There's limited evidence of cryptocurrency usage, but the Taliban did officially ban cryptocurrencies in August 22, and they took very overt measures as well, arresting a number, I think 13 traders in the Herat region, shutting down roughly 20 companies. Then the other important development from a macroeconomic perspective was the decision by the United Nations in 2021 in December to begin bulk cash shipment program into the country. This is done importantly outside of the direct control, at least, of the Taliban administration. The funds have been moved privately and into a private commercial bank for the benefit of the UN and other non-governmental actors. And so that's had economic effects and noticeable economic effects as well.
Gonzalo, if I could just jump in here and briefly talk about crypto just for a second. I want to build a little bit on what Alex was saying about crypto. Other actors in Afghanistan have explored the use of crypto. So ISIL-KP is believed to have received some cryptocurrency. This is a very small amount of funding and a small avenue of finance for terrorist groups in Afghanistan. Most of what we're seeing appears to be going through hawalas that have also set up basically like an informal virtual currency platform, or the ability to cash out virtual currency for the people of Afghanistan. This is a small area. It might grow, but I think for now, this is just very much a watch and wait, and not a significant reason to be particularly concerned about crypto in Afghanistan. So I just wanted to try to head off some of the potential questions and concern in the comments.
Thank you. I think crypto is certainly one of those underlying threats that everyone gets too worried about, and in the end, no one knows how to estimate really. So thank you for your thoughts on that. Unless anyone wants to elaborate a bit more on that question, maybe we can turn to Alex again to address specifically, having this implications in mind, what are the consequences of a terrorist group with this involved in these activities and with these capabilities taking over governmental structures?
Yes, so we are truly in uncharted territory. The Taliban controls a central bank, and while some regimes have had their central banks designated, such as in Iran for sanctions purposes, I'm not aware of a designated terrorist group affirmatively taking over the functions of a central bank. When the Taliban took over in August, they immediately appointed a loyalist with no known banking or finance background as a central bank governor, which is the lead position in the Afghan central bank known as the Afghanistan Bank, or DAB. The Taliban took further provocative steps to insert their leaders in control and key points of the central bank. The number 2 and 3 positions are now held and encumbered by US, UN, EU, UK, and other country designated individuals. So these gentlemen are individually listed by international authorities for prior affiliations to the Taliban, involvement in narco trafficking, involvement in militant activities in support of the Taliban and as full-fledged members of the Taliban. The Taliban Council of Ministers, furthermore, controls and asserts direct control over the central bank. And so we're seeing the integration of the Taliban movement, of the Taliban organization in this function, which should be independent, which should be technocratic in nature, and should be benefiting the Afghan people, which it's not doing. Furthermore, and even more disturbingly from an illicit finance perspective, is that the Taliban controls the Afghan financial intelligence unit called Fintraka. And so in other countries, and the purpose of financial intelligence units is to collect, is to analyze and disseminate financial intelligence information to competent authorities within domestic and international environments. Here, we have a US, international, EU, UK designated terrorist group associated with the Haqqani Network, another designated terrorist organization, running this key governmental function designed to police terrorist groups. I don't have the words. I'm still troubled a year and a half on to really fully come to grasp with this. The US State Department has identified that the FIU Fintraka as of March 22 is quote unquote non-operational, which shouldn't be surprising, but it shows the lack of capabilities from a technical perspective, as well as a political will perspective, to address the harms and the challenges posed by the Taliban, the Haqqani Network, as well as other terrorist groups, as we know, ISIS-K and others operating.
Talking about here, Afghanistan was part of the Egmont Group of Financial Intelligence Units, an international body meant to facilitate information sharing. And states were sharing information and intelligence with the Afghan FIU in order to combat terrorist financing and money laundering. I think it's worth emphasizing that now all of the information that the FIU has, even though it's non-operational, is now in the hands of the Taliban if and when they want to exploit that. The same is also true for intelligence that might have been shared with other intelligence agencies under the former Afghan government. Some steps might have been taken by former employees to sanitize or control that, but really at this point for foreign intelligence services, including foreign financial intelligence units, we have to assume that that information is now burned.
Yes, it's certainly problematic to see how past cooperation in the end can be a source of information for the Taliban now that they have access. So thank you for the harrowing depiction, but still necessary to bring up. But I think now that we're touching on the issues of designated individuals having access to these institutions, we're touching upon a key aspect of this discussion, which is sanctions. So for those in the audience who might not be as familiar with the sanctions regime currently in place, maybe we can get some brief description of what the sanctions currently in place are and how they are affecting the Taliban.
Yes, so it's a bit of a paradox. The sanctions in Afghanistan are not comprehensive sanctions. Comprehensive sanctions occur in jurisdictions like Iran, Syria, and Cuba. And I'm speaking from a U.S. government sanctions perspective. And by way of background, I led the U.S. Treasury Department office at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul from 2018 to 2019. So I worked on these issues day to day for a substantial part of my career. And so as actually a technical matter, and this may give little comfort to those experiencing challenges getting resources into Afghanistan for the benefit of the Afghan people, but Afghanistan is not comprehensively sanctioned. And in fact, the sanctions are rather limited from a technical perspective. And I'll start with the Taliban. So the Taliban have been subject to sanctions by various international and governmental bodies since 1999. The UN designated the Taliban in 1999, as well as the US government. In 2002, after the 9/11 attacks, the US designated the Taliban as an organization, as a specially designated global terrorist, or SDGT. and because of its role in the 9/11 attacks, support for terrorism against the United States and its continuing threat to the United States. That threat in 2023 still remains. That finding is still enforced by the US government. However, it's important to note that these sanctions are against the Taliban. And later on, the UN changed its approach to the sanctions regime and actually switched from a group listing of the Taliban as an entity to an individual listing against individual Taliban officials numbering in the hundreds right now. And so that's important to note that the sanctions by way of the UN just apply to several hundred individual members of the Taliban, but again, are not comprehensively sanctioned as a jurisdiction and don't apply to the entire country. There are also sanctions, as we mentioned, against the Haqqani network. They're designated by the US as an SDGT, as a foreign terrorist organization under Section 219 of the Immigration and Naturalization Act by the State Department. They are also subject to UN and other countries' sanctions. There's also the presence of Al-Qaeda, ISIS-K, IRGC Quds Force, which has been designated by the US government. And according to my research, as of 2022, about 17 terrorist organizations are known to operate in Afghanistan, according to public sources. Again, surprisingly, since the Taliban's takeover, this is another paradox. There have been no additional sanctions against the Taliban. In fact, there has been a strong and purposeful and a movement that I support to provide relief to the Afghan people by creating a series of general licenses, first by OFAC, but also by the United Nations under Security Council Resolution 2615 in December of 2022 that allowed for humanitarian carve-outs for sanctions. This is the first time that it was applied, and it really provided a critical tool to allow countries to, again, help the Afghan people who are suffering under the Taliban regime. And the only affirmative sanctions that have been imposed in the jurisdiction of Afghanistan occurred in November 2021 against ISIS-related officials in a joint action by the Treasury Department and State Department, according to my research. So we're in this very unique place. The other side of it, though, there have been other economic effects. One, international assistance that had been up to 75% of public expenditures annually stopped virtually overnight. And the other part is that Afghanistan is a high risk and low profit jurisdiction for international correspondent banking. So making the business case for banks and other financial institutions to engage with Afghanistan really isn't there from a business perspective. And so these are other factors that I think inform the sanctions conversation with respect to de-risking and the provision of safe, effective, and low-cost financial services into Afghanistan to help the Afghan people.
And just to build on the sanctions question here, so in some other jurisdictions like Canada, for instance, the Taliban is a listed terrorist entity, which effectively makes it comprehensively sanctioned by Canada, which has unfortunate implications in that we now have to figure out a carve-out for providing humanitarian aid because none of our humanitarian organizations are willing to provide aid to Afghanistan with such a broad sweeping designation in place, because the reality of it is if you're providing aid to Afghanistan, the Taliban is likely to benefit in some way. So now our humanitarian aid organizations need, comfort that they're not going to be charged with terrorist financing. And this has stymied our provision of aid, which is really unfortunate. We can talk about that more later, but I wanted to highlight that as well.
If I may, I wanted to also add a few points to the sanctions issues because I think it's extremely important. Well, first of all, within the UN sanctions regime, the Taliban and even the Haqqani network are not actually listed as sanctions in terms of terrorist organizations. For instance, they are very different from those sanctions that are for ISIL-K, for ISIS in general and Al-Qaeda. So that is important to note. That is a difference. But what really do these sanctions really mean? They and see if they have any impact on the functioning of the Taliban at the moment. The current sanctions provide three elements within the Taliban. Number one is asset freeze. Number two is travel ban. And number three is arms embargo. Now, looking into all these three elements in terms of the actual impact of sanctions on the Taliban, in terms of asset freeze, the Taliban's asset currently, both assets and revenues could be assessed, as was discussed earlier, in three levels, really. We have it at the government level, at the group level, and at the individual level. Now, at the government level, they are in possession of almost the entire assets of the Afghan government and the entire revenue systems of the Afghan government, to which these sanctions have absolutely no impact, with the exception of the reserves, the reserve funds that Afghanistan has in the United States have been frozen. Nothing else actually is impacted by these sanctions. At the group level, as discussed earlier, the Taliban's revenues and assets are driven from illicit economic activities, and those are very difficult to pinpoint and trace both inside and outside of Afghanistan. So these sanctions regime are not actually impacting those either. And at the individual level, reports are coming out of Afghanistan that individual Taliban commanders have been going around and basically forcefully taking over public and private property. And that is also something that is happening inside Afghanistan, as not impacted by the sanctions regime. So in terms of asset freeze, in my view, in my assessment, the sanctions regimes are really having at best minimal impact on the Taliban right now. In terms of travel ban, two issues again. If you look at the listed individuals, many of the individual Taliban that are actually listed on those travel ban are not important members of the Taliban government. Some of the very important central figures within the Taliban movement right now are actually not on those travel ban lists. They've been traveling freely. And even those individuals who are on the lists have been actually traveling both in the region and even beyond. And we all know about that. So the travel ban also really is not affecting the Taliban leadership's mobility at all. And then the final element of the sanctions is arms embargo. Now, when the Taliban were an insurgent movement against the Afghan government, that ban may have had some impact on it, but now they are in possession of the entire arsenal of weapons, the entire depots of ammunition, and the entire stockpiles of military equipment that was left over by the Afghan government and also by NATO and American forces. So the Taliban are actually in possession of huge amounts of military equipment, weapons and ammunition that is actually good for them for several decades, perhaps. So they don't actually need any other new weapons and ammunition coming into that. I just wanted to say that the sanctions, even if they are considered comprehensive, which they are not, as was discussed earlier, in reality have very, very minimal, if any, impact on the Taliban.
Please, Jessica, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Arian was saying here that, when we're talking about the weapons that the Taliban has gained control of, I think most of you should be able to see the Q&A boxes that are coming up, but Edmund Fitton-Brown had a really great point, just adding a bit more texture to some of the things that I was talking about, that there's also the issue that intelligence previously shared with Afghan officials is now via the Haqqani network compromised to al-Qaeda. So, the compromise doesn't stop with the Taliban. It does extend to the other groups that the Taliban has cooperated with. And I just wanted to point out too that we're getting some good comments and written nuance to some of the things that we're saying in the Q&A, which can be very helpful for anybody who's new to the conversation. They're giving you some nice references and UN resolution numbers in the
Thanks, Jessica. Yes, certainly I'll keep an eye on the Q&A, then we can address it in just a moment. So we're covering many of the weaknesses of the sanctions regime in Afghanistan. So I'm wondering if anyone has any further thoughts on that. But also, I would like to point out into the discussion that is very relevant and bringing a lot of attention is not only the intended consequences and the weaknesses that sanctions face, but also the unintended consequences of sanctions in the wider population. So Aaron, maybe you can give us some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my assessment, we talked about the intended consequences, which don't unfortunately happen that much, but the unintended consequences, in my view, and from what I am gathering from inside Afghanistan, was actually felt by the Afghan population at large, as opposed to the Taliban. The banking system, as was discussed earlier, is the main sector that has been affected by the sanctions, and the malfunction or the freeze of the banking sector right now is affecting the people, not the Taliban. The Taliban did not have and do not have a lot of funds in the banks. So that does not really affect them. It is actually the Afghan people. It's the normal individuals. It's the business people who have hundreds of thousands, in fact, millions of dollars in the banks and billions of dollars in the banks, but they're only allowed to take out maybe $400 to $450 per month out of the banks. So that is one aspect of the negative unintended impact of the sanctions on the Afghan population. The other unintended consequence is that since the banking system is not working, so all the transactions, most of the transactions now happen through the Hawala network, and the Hawala has really opened up a whole new door for illicit economic activity, for illicit transportation of funds from both within Afghanistan and outside of Afghanistan that is then being utilized by the Taliban and other terrorist groups as well. And then finally, the unintended consequences of the sanctions are on the Afghan economy in general. I mean, the Afghan economy has been really crippled, and one part of that is the impact of sanctions. And it is really not the Taliban at large that are being impacted by this, by the hurt in the Afghan economy, but the Afghan population in general. The Taliban, even before taking over the government, did not have a lot of assets into the legal Afghan economy. Much of what they did was in the illicit economic sphere, but it is really the Afghan population that is being hurt by the damage to the Afghan economy. Overall, my assessment is that while the sanctions do not have their intended consequences and intended impact on the Taliban and other terrorist groups, their unintended impacts are mainly felt by the Afghan population at large rather than by the Taliban.
I just want to pick up a little bit of the thread that Arian was talking about the ineffectiveness of the sanctions, and talk a little bit about two countries that we've talked about or hinted at, and which is Russia and China. Both countries, of course, continue to do business with the Taliban in Afghanistan. In recent weeks, we saw China signing a major oil extraction deal. This will continue to undermine any effective sanctions, because as Arian was talking about, a lot of this, the money for the Taliban is coming domestically. This will also continue to facilitate that. But on the other hand, this has also made China a key target for some of the terrorist groups operating in Afghanistan, such as ISIL-KP. But these deals also enable the Taliban to continue to provide some semblance of service to its population, which is an important part of the power dynamics in Afghanistan. And then adding a little bit of texture to the issue of the Afghan economy. Afghanistan's economy has shrunk by nearly 30% since the Taliban takeover. And according to some estimates, the Taliban government has wiped out 2 decades of gains in Afghan standard of living, with more than 90% of the country suffering from some kind of food insecurity. So these are very serious consequences for the Afghan people, not necessarily for the Taliban. And while Russia and China, I would say, share the bulk of responsibility for enabling the Taliban, other jurisdictions such as Qatar and the UAE are also home to facilitation networks for a variety of different actors, both including the Taliban and other non-state actors. So there are other players that facilitate some of this activity. It is not a unified front against the Taliban by any means.
Thank you. Well, Alex, please jump in.
Yeah, just hopefully a quick point. So I think what we're seeing here is that a lot of these systems on both sides of the equation are not really fit for the current threat environment. So that the sanctions against the Taliban were implemented in 2002, for the most part in the US, when the Taliban was an insurgent group, is now in control of the full territory, or most of the territory of Afghanistan. The sanctions regime are counterterrorism in nature. They're supposed to be the most severe of severe sanctions because there isn't designed to be exemptions and exceptions and licenses to this category of sanctions, because they are intended to provide the most precise effects against targeted individuals and organizations. Here, we've seen the US lead to really reinvent how it approaches counterterrorism financing sanctions, put in 6 separate general licenses, work through the UN to scale that around the globe. And so I think it's going to take time to sort out, but I think it's a question about the efficacy of the sanctions in one instance. The other side is the business environment, which I think we've all touched on now, is that there are sanctions, but then there's also the individual risk decision-making of commercial actors, of businesses, of financial institutions to not engage in Afghanistan, But I would contend, I don't believe at this stage where we are today in January 2023, that is a result or direct result of the sanctions that exist through the UN, that exist through the US and OFAC, that are inhibiting financial services into Afghanistan. So that may be a minority opinion, but I believe that there are many other decisions that are informing that, and principally the risk decisions by financial institutions not to engage with Afghanistan.
Thank you, Alex. Well, I think the discussion has covered many of the weaknesses of the approach that the Western policymaking is facing. So I wonder, at a higher level, maybe I can turn to Aaron and say, what is overall the current policy approach missing? What is the mindset with which we're approaching this, dealing with the Taliban in power that is facing so much, leaving the space for so many weaknesses?
I mean, that is the main question, really. But if we get sort of out of the tactical, operational level analysis to the more strategic level, as you mentioned, I think the international community really, what is really missing in the policy on the part of the international community towards the Taliban is the clarity of policy. And the clarity of policy where? Clarity of policy over whether the world can actually accept and live with a Taliban-run government in Afghanistan. Can they really accept the potential consequences, both to Afghanistan and beyond, into the region and beyond, from a Taliban-run Afghanistan? Those consequences, at least, are the ones for the world, or at least in two ways, in my view. Number one is the spread of terrorism and violent extremism. As Alex mentioned 17. I did some research and I pinpointed 20 foreign terrorist and violent extremist groups currently in operation in Afghanistan. And all those groups have objectives beyond Afghanistan, not in Afghanistan. So it's only a matter of time to see potentially some impact of that terrorism in the region and beyond. Second, it's basically the mere existence of a Taliban-run Afghanistan has given hope to similar-minded groups and organizations across the world, especially in the Muslim world, for probably giving them hope that they can also take over their governments and they can also pick up the trail that was left by Al-Qaeda and other groups. So that is the main consequence of a Taliban-run Afghanistan to the world. The second one, obviously, is the illicit economic activity, the drug industry that we mentioned. All these drugs are not actually used in Afghanistan. They're not even used in the region because these are very expensive drugs. And so the consumer market for these are mainly Western Europe and Northern America. Now, can the world really accept that? Can the world really let the Taliban produce and procure this amount of drugs and send it to their capitals and to their main cities? On the other side is the consequences to Afghanistan itself. It's a moral question. It's a nation of 40 million individuals really being taken captive by a group of, at max, 70,000 fanatical individuals. How long can this really continue? The way they are dealing with women, the way they're dealing with minorities, the way they're running the country. There's literally no resemblance of a government in what the Taliban are doing. So in my view, at the very top strategic level, it is the world needs to decide what they're going to do with the Taliban. Now, I do understand the hesitation on the part of the international community, particularly the West, to engage in any types of intervention in Afghanistan. I understand that. The world has been there for 20 years. The world bled there. The world hemorrhaged money there. And so the appetite for going back into Afghanistan is either non-existent or very little. But the past is past. The past is gone. And that doesn't mean that what is going to unfold potentially for Afghanistan, for the region, and potentially beyond can be completely ignored. In my view, the world needs to make a decision as to what they really want to do. Can they live with the Taliban, or can they really bring back the Taliban through more pressure to the negotiating table for the full and perhaps a proper implementation of the Doha Agreement, in which the Taliban made clear commitments to the Afghan people and to the world in terms of what they were going to do?
Thank you, Aaron. I think Aaron has pointed to many great issues, such as can we live with the Taliban, how we're going to approach it. So I'm wondering if Jessica and Alex, you have any thoughts on how Western governments can tackle this and move forward, and how they should be reconceptualizing the approach in the coming years.
Yeah, so for some countries, such as Canada, I actually think that we need to soften our sanctions to allow more aid, because our counter-terrorist financing legislation is written so broadly without any of those carve-outs that, as I mentioned earlier, the Canada-based aid organizations are not really able to provide aid to Afghanistan. This is really based on the fear that they're going to be prosecuted for terrorist financing, because any aid that goes to Afghanistan will benefit the Taliban. And this isn't untrue. The Taliban benefits from aid from the international community in the sense that it provides the people of Afghanistan with goods, services that the Taliban then doesn't have to turn around and provide. They can also profit from it directly. But we need to acknowledge that that aid is necessary, lest the humanitarian situation become more dire. So it's not the idea that we can cut off all aid to Afghanistan in order to starve the Taliban. We've already talked about how that wouldn't work, because so much of the money isn't coming in from outside of the country anyway. So it's just a realization that there needs to be a bit of a give and take there. And while I think that we should be using all of the tools in our toolkit to try to change Taliban behavior in Afghanistan, such as things like the issue of education, work, and healthcare for women and girls, I think history has shown that the Taliban are not likely to soften on many of these points, although, of course, diplomatic and aid efforts should continue on this front. And the role of sanctions in changing these types of Taliban behavior is probably extremely limited. So, being very clear-eyed about what the role of sanctions is here. I'll echo Arian, though. I think that we do need clarity, global clarity and policy in our implementation of sanctions and in our approach to the Taliban that needs to really reflect the reality of spoilers to a lot of the policies that many countries in the West particularly would want to see implemented for Afghanistan. So what I'm advocating for here is really a nuanced, realistic view of Taliban sanctions. We need to do what we can for the people of Afghanistan while minimizing how the Taliban can profit from that.
These are all great points. Just a couple to close out. One, I think that Jessica was hitting on, Narayan, as well, is that the Taliban has been pretty immune from the types of leverage or attempted coercion by the international community. They've been non-responsive about women's education, girls' education, the ban on women working in NGOs that recently went into effect. There needs to be a better approach to understanding how the Taliban will respond and finding the constituencies within the Taliban governing structure that can be identified and will be responsive to incentives and disincentives. And so that seems to have not played out at present. The Taliban seems very content with a reduced economy, substantially reduced international assistance, but maintaining regime survival and maintaining control over their territory. What the other international Western governments should be doing here, I think, is stronger international coordination on areas of shared interest, particularly on counterterrorism financing cooperation. There's a lot of shared interests on that topic, as Jessica mentioned, Arya mentioned, in the regional dynamic. The effects and the instability that occurs even with Taliban control of Afghanistan and most of the territory will have regional effects, and if not international effects. We've seen this before in the 1990s. And this has had wide-ranging international implications for US foreign policy and national security. I'm concerned we're repeating history and we haven't internalized the lessons of figuring out ways for cooperation. The identification of Ayman al-Zawahiri in downtown Kabul under the ostensible protection of the Taliban Haqqani network is a demonstrable indication that the Taliban is not committed to wide-ranging terrorism, combating terrorism. And if in fact they are more complicit in harboring and providing safe haven to any number of terrorist organizations. Their only noticeably avowed enemy is ISIS-K at the time, and they are still struggling to contain that threat as well. So I think working with adversaries, working with allies and partners both in the region, so talking Pakistan, UAE, Qatar, Turkey, China, Russia on these shared interests, I think will be a path forward for the international community and the like-minded allies in the West.
Thank you, Alex. Well, I'm conscious of time. Unless any speaker wants to add any final thoughts, we could also turn to that after the questions. But we're seeing a lot of engagement in the Q&A function, so we can turn to that. and we could maybe collect them into different areas. And the illicit sources of stream are source of wealth are attracting quite attention in the. So one of them is asking to whatever speaker might like to intervene: is remittance money considered to be illicit?
So I'll jump in on that, and we'll see if the others want to do so as well. From my perspective, no, I don't consider remittance money to be illicit at all. It's potentially undocumented, it's potentially underreported, but it's not illicit per se.
And then specifically under US law, OFAC issued a general license permitting remittances specifically. So while it may not have been absolutely necessary, it was a policy signal to support remittances. By some estimations, remittances accounted for about 4% of GDP before the Taliban's takeover. From my economic analysis, this has a multiplier effect so that it helps more families than just that 4% of GDP, and also prevents families from needing to get on international assistance, NGO assistance, and so really allows for a benefit that is outsized. The other part of it too is that there are now a number of new American citizens and lawful permanent residents and other refugees who have found a home across the world, who are hopefully in better financial circumstances to be able to assist their families who are still remaining in Afghanistan. And so I think there is a policy commitment for this to maintain it, but it has to be controlled. It has to be subject to appropriate AML CFT controls as identified by the Financial Action Task Force over the past 20 years, because there is the possibility of abuse by money services businesses, and there is a demonstrable historical record on that.
Sorry. Thank you for that, Alex. I think we have multiple questions. We still have some time to go over some of them. Some just asking straight to the point, what has to be done. I think we're all trying to unpack here that today. But there was a good question on, so we were talking about the consequences of the Taliban having taken over governmental structures. And we have a good question from Daniel Mark saying, is there any suggestion that Taliban are utilizing FinTracker as a means of gathering information on those who they don't consider supportive of their aims? So would a stronger FinTracker actually be positive in that regard?
If I may start on that, I mean, I don't think they could be utilizing FinTracker for their own purposes now, because FinTracker doesn't seem to be functioning that well right now. Certainly, there is, to my knowledge, there is no level of cooperation between FinTracker and their counterparts outside of Afghanistan after the takeover of the government by the Taliban. So in terms of the current operations, in my view, that is not a concern. But as mentioned earlier, as I talked about earlier, all the information that existed within FinTracker has been utilized by the Taliban. And an angle of that is the potential sharing of information with other intelligence agencies, with other countries that the Taliban did have and do have relationships. That is also a matter of concern, especially information pertaining to other countries getting on the gray list or on the blacklist or, some of those lists. It is very possible that the Taliban may have shared very sensitive information with those countries, and those countries could actually utilize that in their own benefit in an illicit way.
The only thing I'll add to that is just on the issue of FinTracker and the Egmont Group. So FinTracker, Afghanistan's FIU, was suspended from the Egmont Group shortly after the Taliban takeover. I'll point out, though, that information exchanges are governed by country-to-country memorandums of understanding. So theoretically, it's possible that some countries continue to share information with Afghanistan and their financial intelligence unit, although based on what we've heard, both from Arian and other sources, it does seem like the FIU is non-operational at this point.
Thanks, Jessica. Well, I think we could turn to the impacts of the unintended consequences of sanctions. And there's a good question on humanitarian assistance from Francis de Souza. asking is there any evidence that humanitarian assistance in the form of cash handouts via local and international NGOs are actually reaching those most in need?
If I may, and again, this is based on anecdotal evidence that I'm getting from Afghanistan. It's obviously there's no systematic assessment of this that at least I know of. Yes and no. I think what I'm gathering is that the humanitarian assistance that is going into Afghanistan right now, mainly through the United Nations, does have some positive impact on the people and on the economy. The number one positive impact of that is the maintenance of stability of the Afghan currency, the value of the Afghan currency. Had it not been for the amounts of funds going into Afghanistan through the United Nations, inflation would have skyrocketed, and that would have had potentially larger negative impacts on the Afghan economy and on the people's ability to purchase. So that is number one. Number two is the cash transfers and also in-kind transfers do reach at least some of the individuals and families that are in need. But what is concerning is the Taliban's utilization of that. From what I am gathering, I've not seen any instances where the Taliban would have had direct access to those funds. But indirectly, obviously, the Taliban do benefit from this in terms of charging protection funds, as discussed earlier, protection money. They do that. In terms of the contracts that are handed out by the implementing partners of the United Nations, what I am getting is that small firms that are affiliated with the Taliban or even potentially owned by Taliban members are getting those contracts. And so they are benefiting from that. In terms of the direct transfer of funds, cash, or in-kind transfers to individuals, I'm getting many individuals affiliated with the Taliban that are actually getting these funds. Whether or not they are in need is a different question, but the fact that they are affiliated with the Taliban, they are getting that. Now, given the circumstances and given the situation, could this really be fixed? I am not sure. But at least the amounts of funds that are going in have some positive impact on people and on the Afghan economy currently.
And I would agree with Aryan on that. The money is, I can't say categorically or globally reaching every beneficiary, but money is still moving through. The pain points are one on increased costs for hawala transactions and increase in fees or less preferred exchange rates that adds friction, adds costs to the provision of services. The other part, and I'm not advocating for the suspension of any funds, but any of these humanitarian activities are a de facto subsidy to the Taliban in that they are not having to provide state services, welfare, public services to the Afghan people who they now oversee and they control through force. And so there's a policy challenge there. Again, I'm not advocating for the suspension of any funds, but I think it must be recognized in any negotiations and finding areas of leverage with the Taliban that the international community, NGOs, are providing this incredible benefit to any number of vulnerable Afghans. And the Taliban needs to appreciate that and provide concessions for that consideration.
Thank you to both. Jessica, earlier you were talking about the let's call them external spoilers, some countries that were engaging with the Taliban and were entailing some kind of support. We have a question on how far this clandestine financial support by countries was and is available to the Taliban. There were some mentions of interest in Pakistan in the chat also. So I'm wondering if you would like to develop a bit further on this.
Yeah, so there's a lot of international players and that have either lax controls or turn a blind eye to illicit financing. I've mentioned some of them. Maybe I'll refrain from calling out too many people by name today, but these networks do exist. Some of them involve professional enablers like accountants, company formation agents, there's a whole bunch of people that are facilitating. What they did before was facilitate sort of the exfiltration of wealth from Afghanistan. Some of that activity can now be used for the Taliban, but a lot of it is within country, as Arian was talking about very clearly. But to me, this really points to the need to continue to strengthen the international financial system and to continue to address the role of professional enablers and some of the jurisdictions that have maybe turned a blind eye or looked away from some of the activities that have enabled the Taliban over the course of the last 15, 20 years, and to a certain extent that are enabling some of the other terrorist groups that operate in Afghanistan. So to me, there's a continued role for increased and ongoing international financial due diligence to try to shut some of these loopholes. Because what ends up happening is that when one country strengthens its regulatory regimes or its legislation and then policies and practices related to that legislation, is that it can displace the activity to other jurisdictions. So we really need to try to continue to shore up the global financial system and not just focus on one particular region, because there's that displacement effect that really happens.
Thank you. There's a question that is quite relevant now with the crisis on semiconductors, and it's regarding Afghanistan being rich in lithium and international actors such as China and Pakistan being interested in trade. So anyone would like to comment to the potential implications of this and how this would continue to support the Taliban economy?
If I may, again, based on anecdotal information I'm getting from inside Afghanistan, is that the exploitation of the mineral resources, particularly lithium and other related elements, have really gone high since the takeover of the Taliban. At least in the past, before the takeover of the Taliban, the former government, yes, it was very corrupt. There's no doubt about that. But at least there were systems in place. There were mechanisms in place for handing over contracts for the exploitation of mineral resources. And now it seems that there's absolutely no mechanism. The Taliban are basically selling out mineral resources to basically whoever wants to buy them. What I'm hearing is that there is a proactive decision by the Taliban leadership to sell medium-level mineral mines as fast as possible and as much as possible. They don't care about the small level. They can't go for the big ones because the big ones are easily traceable. So the mid-level mines are being exploited really unsystematically and in an ad hoc basis. And Chinese companies are very much active there, both after lithium and other minerals. And it seems that the situation for some of the Chinese companies is very much favorable right now, as they can exploit these resources without having to go through stringent contracting mechanisms that they had to in the previous Afghan government.
Thank you. I think we have time to answer one more question, which I think would be an interesting reconceptualization of the approach, since we were discussing with so many witnesses in how countries are approaching a Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. So we have a question asking, would removing the sanctions and recognizing the Taliban an option, given that pressuring them is more effective if they are engaged with the international community?
I'll jump on this one. The purpose of the U.S. negotiations with the Taliban, the Doha process, was for recognition of the Taliban and removal from both international, and I understand that to be UN, and U.S. sanctions. The Taliban broke from that agreement. And so I really don't see a world, at least, especially not in the immediate term, where that is on the table. As an order of process, that would generally have to come through the UN, because the US sanctions are implementing UN sanctions under US law. And so that agreement at the UN, I think is a remote possibility, is a very far off possibility. I mean, it's always a possibility, but is not something that is probable in the near or medium term.
Thanks, Alex. Okay, so we're almost out of time. Sadly, we cannot answer any last questions, but Any last thoughts from the speakers before we close the event?
I'm just humbled by the comments and the questions. This is an incredible group. So thank you all. I realize we didn't get to all the questions that were put in the Q&A, but this is an incredibly knowledgeable group. So thank you all for joining today.
I'll echo that too. I've been quite engaged with reading the Q&A and sort of the specifics that are coming in that way. And it's been really quite a dynamic conversation. So thank you very much.
Same here. It's been a pleasure being on the panel, and thank you all for the engagement and for the great comments and questions.
Well, I want to thank the speakers for their great interventions, the lively discussion. There was not only questions, but as they're all noting, great comments that continue to inform the discussion. And we welcome you all to tune into our next events. Thank you so much for the engagement, and stay tuned for